Okay, I'm Brett Premack. I'm joined today by my friend Walter Kolosky, who's just written a book that I have been reading and really enjoying, Mahavishnu Memories, about the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Now, for those of you who are new to the Mahavishnu Orchestra, why don't we start there? Walter, who was the Mahavishnu Orchestra and why were they and are they important?
The Mahavishnu Orchestra was really the first band, I would say, jazz rock band that achieved any acclaim. They achieved some commercial success, probably because of the time in which they played. You know, people were more open, um, but it featured mostly jazz players with a little mix of rock music, and because of that, it created a new vocabulary for those genres. You had John McLaughlin, who was the leader and founder of the band from England. He was known at that time in the US for playing with Miles Davis, but he had a long career before that. You had Jerry Goodman from the rock group The Flock, which was popular in the US, especially in the Chicago area, the Midwest, which is where Jerry was from. You had a Czech keyboard player who had played with Sarah Vaughan, Jan Hammer. Uh, the Panamanian / US drummer Billy Cobham, who was a powerhouse and met John while they were recording with Miles Davis. And of course, Rick Laird, the bass player who held everything together. Their music was incendiary, but it was their live performances outside of their well-received records that really I focus on in Mahavishnu Memories.
And in terms of jazz, rock, fusion, whatever they wanted to call it, uh, we have to say that John McLaughlin, along with Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter, these guys were the founders of that particular branch of the jazz tree. Uh, but Miles was really in the forefront, of course, with the release of Bitches Brew and In a Silent Way. Those were the first two recordings that really opened it up to many people. Bitches Brew, of course, became one of the best-selling jazz records of all time. And I was very lucky to see the Tony Williams lifetime. After Tony Williams, the great drummer, left Miles, I guess it was like probably 69, he formed a trio with John McLaughlin and the great organist Larry Young. And I caught them, I guess it was in like 70, perhaps 71, at a small club in New York called Ongano's.
Yes.
It was the loudest thing I ever heard. I mean, it was just unbelievable. But the amount of power and energy that group generated was really something else, but perhaps a little bit ahead of their time. A lot of people were still trying to figure the jazz fusion thing out. Do you recall, or you have any thoughts about the Tony Williams lifetime with John McLaughlin?
Well, sure. A lot of the themes that ended up in Mahavishnu music came from that period of time in Tony Williams' lifetime. I do remember an interview I had with Herbie Hancock, and he talked about going to see Tony Williams' lifetime, and they were so loud. He was in the venue, probably in Ganu's, and he remembered thinking, "This is going to damage my hearing for the rest of my life, but I don't care. I'm going to, I'm going to risk it." And so he went in, but of course, that music was never the management never had their act together, and of course, the music probably was ahead of its time. It was loud and in your face and improvised music. And later on, when Jack Bruce joined the band and they went over to England, people expected Cream. Instead, they got Lifetime, and a lot of them didn't like it. They couldn't take it. But still, that that was a precursor to Mahavishnu, and everything that's happened since then in many types of jazz and rock music that we still hear today.
Well, I think those of us who were lucky enough to hear them live, it certainly left a memorable impression. Uh, just, excuse me, I bring up the subject of loudness. Mahavishnu Orchestra also was rather loud.
Oh, yes.
Why do you think they played that loud?
Well, I've seen it described sometimes, and I like this description. So I want to make it clear, and I come to this conclusion in the book. They played too loud, especially for many halls and for their hearing later in life, and for the hearing of a lot of the audience members. Um, but there was a power that came with that loudness, almost a wind, a velocity that came to you that was part of the experience. Uh, and in fact, in one part of the book, there's a talk of a study about loudness and volume, and they use the Mahavishnu Orchestra as an example, probably of what not to do, but they they joke in there about people turning and said those players must be deaf. How can they deal with it? And somebody else says, well, because they're already deaf. That's how they, that's how they can deal with the volume up on stage. I once heard it described as music that loud eliminates everything else in the world. It's almost sort of a cavern, and it's just you and the music. There's nothing else that exists, and that power, I do believe, is valid. Not a good thing for your ears, but from a standpoint of an experience, it was important to the band.
Well, it certainly was a physical experience hearing
Yes.
music. Um, but at that time, it was not uncommon for bands to play very loud. I saw the New York debut of Cream at the Cafe A Go-Go. I guess that was the summer of 68, 67, 68. And they were also incredibly loud as well. So,
Oh, but the difference was this was jazz. And that's the difference because you're correct. So this was jazz played at the volume of rock music. And oftentimes, of course, like the Cafe Au Go-Go, a small venue. Even today, I've been in some small venues, brick lined interior, and the band comes up and they are so loud, that you have to do that. But they feel, for whatever reason, that they have to play at that volume to get their point across.
one of our viewers, Frederick Adlers, has asked, wasn't Lifetime super loud before this? The answer is yes. Lifetime was incredibly loud. As I mentioned before, I saw the Lifetime at a small club, and it was also very intense. Let's talk a little bit about the music that Mahavishnu played. Uh, you mentioned that word jazz. I mean, it's definitely improvisation. Uh, what were some of the other elements that Mahavishnu Orchestra incorporated in their music to make that unique fusion of what they did, Walter?
Well, it's all in there. The jazz is in there, the rock is in there, the blues is in there, all underpinned, although not classically, but all underpinned by what I would call an Indian-like groove, a mantra. When I think of Mahavishnu and repeating riffs, that's the term that comes to my mind, that this was this music that produced, a mantra after mantra that you could get wrapped up in. It's almost a circle. I think of tunes like Celestial Terrestrial Commuters, one of my favorites, and especially the last minute of that song. It's a whirlwind that captures all of those elements as Indian elements and the rock, and of course the jazz. Even though it's repetitive, this is really what they did. They repeated themes that brought you in, and then they take you on a trip. This was the improvisation or the call and responses. I don't want to call it a battle because it wasn't a battle, but it was a conversation, often conducted at supersonic speed, jet-like volume, jet plane-like volume that you were brought into. And your ears even had a hard time catching up. But if you were able to catch up, you were captured.
Now, you mentioned the aspect of Indian music, specifically Indian classical music, which is an improvisational medium in itself. But also, we must mention that John McLaughlin was a spiritual man. He was a devotee of Sri Chinmoy. In fact, when he appeared, unlike many other people of the era with long hair and fancy clothes, short hair, dressed totally in white, had like a spiritual demeanor to that. Do you think that Walter Mahavishnu Orchestra played spiritual music?
I think they did. Now, to be blunt, the other members, weren't followers like John was. Now, Rick was relatively spiritual as opposed to religious. And I think I wrote one time that even if they didn't think they played spiritual music, the other players, Jan, Billy, Jerry, they did. There was an aura around it. And in fact, if you want to go deeper, I tend to think that most music is spiritual in a sense. But again, this is looking at an element of the time in which this took place. And John did stick out, but not in a tremendous way, because there were gurus behind every tree and every corner in the city at that time. The Beatles, of course, and a little earlier. There was a special years ago on George Harrison. I can't quite remember the name of it. It was done by Scorsese,
Right.
and George was interviewed at length, and I told John he sounded like John. They spoke the same way. So I think there were Nehru jackets. There's all sorts of things going on in the late '60s and early '70s that added to the aura that this music has and how it was presented. When it comes to Mahavishnu, they had these famous records that are listened to this very day. However, the real legendary part of Mahavishnu was seeing the band live. It was an experience, not to everyone's liking, but to enough people's liking that they became a popular phenomenon. And speaking of records, had an album, an instrumental album with tunes that were 9 and 10 minutes long, reached number 15 in the pop charts. That's how popular they got. They never had wide radio play. But I think if you talk to Mahavishnu fans, the ones that are most engaged and the ones that remember the band most are from the live performances.
Yes, well, I was one of those people who got to experience the band live, and it was particularly memorable. I saw them at Wesleyan University, and they came out, and of course, as we mentioned, they played very loud. They played so loud and used up so much energy, the electricity went off.
Yeah.
They had to take a 15-minute break. Before we talk about the live performances, and especially about what you've done in the book, I just want to go over each of the musicians in the band, because I feel that the Mahavishnu Orchestra was composed of 5 virtuoso musicians who went on to become very influential. Rick Laird, interestingly, before Rick Laird played with Mahavishnu, he was playing bass with the Buddy Rich Orchestra.
Yeah, he played with Wes Montgomery. He played with Yusuf Lateef. He played with a lot of jazz legends. He was the house bassist at Ronnie Scott's, the famous Ronnie Scott's in London. So he played with all the greats. He really did, including Buddy Rich. And in fact, Buddy, when he hired Rick, he wanted him to play the stand-up bass upright. But Rick says, I'm not going to travel all over the world carrying that damn thing around. I'm going to bring an electric bass. And he told me that Buddy didn't care for that. But after a few shows, he started really liking the electric bass. And of course, Buddy fired Rick 4 or 5 times because he was so mercurial. but Rick said he kept coming back because he paid him a little more to bring him back. So he did well. He did well in that band when all is said and done. I became very close to Rick, and we spoke maybe once every other week for the past 20 years. And it's very sad when he passed away a couple of years ago on July 4. He was spiritual, by the way. Again, not quite the same as John, but he had sought out the same type of things. And he was very attuned to the world in every aspect. He never wanted to be that famous. He wanted to have the particular role that had always been played by bass players in jazz bands, which was to support the rhythm section, be part of that. However, interestingly, and I write about this in the book, toward the end of the band's lifetime, probably because they were breaking up, he was given more and more space. And there are some solos toward the end, extended solos that actually carry some of the pieces. And you'd say, wow, Rick Laird, that guy was more of a virtuoso than you even knew. And I think that's one of the things you'll learn in this book, how important Rick was.
Yeah, definitely. Jan Hammer, I think, was one of the prime movers initially of using the synthesizer in the way that he did. Some people may remember, perhaps people who aren't as old as we are. We're old? Yes, I can't believe it. We're old. Did the music for Miami Vice, which kind of made some money, certainly, and brought him to attention. He created he helped give the group a very distinctive sound.
Oh, he certainly did. He first played the Moog at Staples High School. That was the first performance in 1972. And, am I getting my dates wrong? July of 1972, I believe. If not, it was July of 72. And that was the very first time. And he was so excited about it, he wrote a letter to his parents, also noted in the book. He sent them a postcard. Yesterday was the first day I played this new instrument, and it gives the band this entirely new sound. And of all the members in Mahavishnu, it wasn't just John who was into Indian music. Jan was into it in a big way. And that's how he saw the synthesizer, if you can think about it, as a resonating stringed Indian instrument, in a way, if you really think about it. And we're talking about a band that had three people who were the melodic players, and they traded off each other. And sometimes Jan on that synthesizer could sound like a guitar. And so it was almost like you had two guitar players up there. And of course, in the higher register, Jerry would join them. But this really did change the band. Now, the band, he was changing the regular electric piano even before this by bending notes on the Rhodes and things that people had never really heard, using some devices. Later on, toward the end of the band, he started using even more unusual devices.
Yeah. And important part of the Mahavishnu son, Jerry Goodman on violin. Not that many, excuse me, not that many violinists play jazz and play the kind of music that the Mahavishnu Orchestra did. Interestingly, something you get into the book, in the book, you talk about Mahavishnu did some gigs, some touring with the Mothers of Invention when Jean-Luc Ponty, the great violinist, was also part of the thing, part of the scene. And could you say a few words about Jerry Goodman?
Well, Jerry Goodman was the rock and roller. He brought the patched blue jeans into the band. I'm always amazed because Jerry self-confidence wasn't the best. And you listen to him play and you say, I just can't believe this because he's a giant. When you listen to him play. And he was a rebel. And in certain places, say Chicago, or in the earliest days of the band, he was the most well-known person to many of the people that came to see the band. So when John would introduce Jerry, especially in concerts in Chicago, he would get the loudest applause by far. I look at him and he talks about not having the confidence and sometimes not feeling that he belonged in the band, if you can believe that. But some of the videos show him so engaged and so into the music that I could just watch him. And oftentimes when I listen to the music, when you listen to some music over and over and over again, even these live performances that I had a chance to listen to hundreds of shows, I will isolate the players. And sometimes I'll do that with Jerry or Rick and spend the entire time listening to the hour-and-a-half concert or 2 hours or whatever it is, listening to that instrument. And if Jerry could be one of us listening, he'd say, that guy has his shit together.
Yeah, he definitely had his shit together. Billy Cobham, the powerhouse drummer, came to the forefront with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. That's when people really heard about him. I mean, he came on the scene originally with Horace Silver and some other stuff, and then recorded with Miles. But when he played with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, that's when people said, who is Billy Cobham? I mean, from my perspective, before Billy, Tony Williams was really the powerhouse of the drums. Billy arrives and takes it to the next level and made a really important contribution to the group, for sure.
Yeah, I don't know how much the kit has to do with it in a way, because, of course, Tony, tremendously powerful, but I'd almost say in a smaller way. It was more concentrated, whereas, and I don't mean smaller in a negative way at all. But Billy, I mean, that resonated, and it may be because, well, the two bass drums at a certain point, he started playing double bass drum, and just the power. And of course, I've written about this before, and I think this is important with almost every type of act, is the visual. And there was this impressive physique, hitting the drums faster than you could see, but you could hear every beat. And he propelled that band like a machine. Now, sometimes people say, well, it was a machine, but I don't think they're hearing the nuances or the way he's picking up cues or giving cues, or for instance, the drum solo on one word that he does, that drum solo, which he did hundreds of times, could stand on its own for space and texture and power. But he was a main driver. He was provided the thrust for at least the powerful music that came from the stage when that band played. And of course, he and John McLaughlin were so tuned in that the phenomenon produced in itself was thrilling.
I think a different musical form, but I would compare the relationship of John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham to that of Elvin Jones and John Coltrane. Elvin was such a key element of Coltrane's music, and when they played together, it was magic. Same thing with Billy and with John.
Absolutely. It's a great comparison. And of course, it shouldn't be overlooked, some of John Coltrane's Far Eastern interest toward the end of his career. And of course, at a certain point, this is why John McLaughlin sought out Elvin to play with him on an album. And of course, Jan Hammer had played with Elvin. And yes, similar drummers in that sense of power. I think that's what I would, that's the similar thing that they shared.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this book, Mahavishnu Memories. There is a link in the description. I highly recommend that you check it out because it's more than a book of just gigs. This is a book that contains personal remembrances from fans and friends of the music, which really gives the book a more personal touch, a more humane touch. And also, by including information about the groups that Mahavishnu played with, in terms of like the Mothers and Return to Forever and many other surprising groups, it kind of puts the music in the context of the times, because culturally, those were different times. Walter and I are both survivors of those times, and we look back upon them as a fantastic amount of creativity and excitement that was happening then. Why did you decide to do this kind of book, Walter?
That's an answer that has, that's a question that has a few different answers. I think what first led me to be interested in it is that Elliot Sears, the manager of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, he tended to save a lot of stuff. And every once in a while, I'd get a peek at it. There'd be a list of the gigs, the notes that he would have about the gigs, and what they were going to do, the calendar. And he'd saved a lot of stuff that I was able to get views of. And I said, boy, this is pretty good information. I didn't think much of it at the time, but well, except that it formed the basis for me working on a gig list for the band, these itineraries that he still had. And so I spent years searching out material for this gig list, and it became quite popular on the net. It's there in a new form, by the way, on walterkolosky.com. Which also has a lot of Mahavishnu stuff on it. And for those who are reading the book, I suggest you go there. And for those who aren't, you should go there anyway. There's lots of cool stuff there. And just looking at that, the more I got into it, I said, this is, a very interesting time. And I've covered almost every aspect of Mahavishnu music, except maybe the most important aspect, which was their live performances. What was it like for the listener when the Mahavishnu Orchestra came to your town? Really, what was it like? What was it like to be at a college in Iowa and this band shows up and blasts you out of the small gymnasium or venue? You never heard of them. You get to go into the concert for free sometimes. And this is really what garnered my interest. I looked at some other books in the genre, and they were good. But I wanted to make it a little different. And that's why I decided to personalize it. I'm an old newspaper reporter, and so I looked at every concert as an individual story with characters in it. And if I could find somebody that was at a show, and I could bring out of them how it affected them, and then they were a candidate to be in this book. And I talked to maybe 300 people for this book. It took me 5 years to write this book. And I talked to them. But this drew me into the social aspects of the time, as you had mentioned before. This music wasn't in a vacuum. There were things going on that were competing against it at colleges and other places, and I discussed those things. The music business was changing, and I discussed that in here, and how bands like Mahavishnu were changing it and opening up people's minds. I thought this was a story to tell, not just for the people that were there sharing the memories, But I've written about John McLaughlin and Mahavishnu now for for over 25 years. Um, and I know there are a lot of young people, many young musicians who are fascinated with the story. And you're going to learn more of the story of music of those times than you ever thought possible in this book. I made sure of that. You're going to learn about the rip-offs. You're going to learn about criminal activities in the music business and the concert business. Uh, but most importantly, you're going to hear about the positive impact that new music, and that's what I'm just going to call this, was new music, can have on the psyches of people. And many of the people I write about that I spoke to, it's 50 some years later, they are still affected by this one concert or two concerts or 20, because, they had their own version of the Deadheads following them around. For instance, Carlos Santana, would show up when he could. People of that nature, and even sophisticated jazz musicians, they had to check it out, so they'd show up at some of these shows, and rock players, Miles Davis would be backstage, Laura Nyro. You wouldn't think of Laura Nyro at a Mahavishnu show, or David Crosby would be at a show. George Harrison, for instance, perhaps at a show. And so you're going to learn about all those people and from a lot of those people. And I do interview a lot of contemporary jazz players that opened for Mahavishnu, rock players too, that opened for Mahavishnu. What was it like? And so sometimes you'll hear, we died 1,000 deaths. As one person told me. Whereas other bands would claim they made us play better than we ever played before in our lives, because they just felt the motivation to play better when they heard virtuosity.
Well, some of those bands that opened for the Mahavishnu Orchestra, I found quite interesting. Aerosmith, Cheap Trick, the comedian Martin Mull
Yes.
was opening. How did they determine who the opening act was going to be?
Well, obviously, in the early days, they were most often the opening act, but they would play anywhere. So, they'd play for $750. If some gig was on the way to some other gig. This is really what did Mahavishnu in the end, because just too many gigs. It just, the music was so demanding to play every night just became a problem. But when Mahavishnu had the power, they started having opening acts by their choice. They tended to go with, people that were one person, because they didn't want to have to redo the stage every night and things. So they found, Leo Kottke was a great opener. And you'd be surprised by some of the single solo acts, that opened for Mahavishnu. They get on and off, and it was very simple, and they'd stay on the whole tour with them, where they were going through Europe or the United States. Leo played quite a few shows with them.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about that period, people were more open to other kinds of music, not just pigeonholing one group. In New York at the time, there were several radio stations. It was WABC FM that I called to mind, where they would play Coltrane 1 minute and the Mothers of Invention the next. And nowadays, it's like, well, the world has changed so much. Radio is very segmented, exactly what it is. But I think having an artist like Leo Kottke, totally different than the Mahavishnu Orchestra, the audience dug him, and they dig the Mahavishnu Orchestra. They were open to that.
Yeah, it was a different time. Taj Mahal would open quite a few times. It was entirely a different time when minds were open. We don't want to sound like those old people that we are, but minds were more open. And, just imagine, well, Taj Mahal, the Pointer Sisters, they'd open for Mahavishnu. You just think about that. You just can't. Cheech and Chong, Mahavishnu opened up for Cheech and Chong. And of course, nobody, I won't say nobody, but most of the people were there to see Cheech and Chong. And so a lot of the crowd left when Mahavishnu performed. But when all the people watching Cheech and Chong came back, this happened up in Berkeley, when all the people who had watched Mahavishnu were still sitting in their seats, and the people who wanted to see Cheech and Chong came back, all those people were sitting there glassy-eyed. They were zombies, and Cheech and Chong played like 40 minutes. It just wasn't happening. So you have plenty of stories like that. You have bomb threats and humorous stories and some touching stories throughout the book. But you can imagine, that music, even though it could be beautiful, really came out and punched you in the face. And if you weren't ready for it, you'd be dazed after you heard it, and dazed for days.
Absolutely. I think one of the more interesting double bills for me was the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. That was the edition of the Mothers that included Jean-Luc Ponty and George Duke. Frank Zappa had a number of different groups over the years. Any relationship, any meeting of the minds between Frank Zappa and John McLaughlin?
I don't think so. Not outwardly, but I have a couple of stories about that, and some people are familiar with this. Frank at that time claimed that he didn't even pay attention to Mahavishnu when they were performing, but all the band members say that was crap, that he would be behind the curtains or whatever watching Mahavishnu every night. And I'll never forget, now I didn't know this information at the time, and I'm not saying this relates to all Frank Zappa music, but Frank, who I liked all his music from that time. When I was young and I had my Heathkit amplifier that I had made, and I had my turntable that I had literally rescued from a garbage dump that I hooked up to it. Those were the days. And I stored it, by the way, in a boot box. I lifted it because I had no spring action. It was set in a boot box for my school boots. I'm listening to radio here in Boston. WBCN was the station here. I'm listening to this tune. I said, "Oh my God, a new Mahavishnu tune." It was a big long tune. I go, "Wow, this is fantastic." And at the end, the guy in WBCN goes, "That was the latest from the Mothers of Invention." And I go, "Boy, very interesting." And this was here around, late 73, 74. So there was an influence there. And some band members will tell you that after that tour, Frank's music took a different direction. He was more into, different time signatures than he had been and whatnot. And so not obvious, but I think inwardly there was a meeting of the minds. What I do know is that at one of the shows, Jean-Luc Ponty and Jerry Goodman played a classical music piece behind the stage together. Those are the type of stories that I like to hear about.
For sure. Why do you think, you mentioned before they played a lot of gigs in just a couple of years, really. Why do you think that took such a toll on them? And perhaps it was one of the reasons the group did not stay together.
Well, their manager, Nat Weiss, was a protege and friend, business friend, and friend in real life of Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles. And there were quite a few connections between the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, etc., and Mahavishnu that you'll learn about in this book, much more than I ever knew about before I did the research. What was that question again? I forgot the question.
The question.
That's good. Oh,
I forgot the question too. This is one of the perils of aging. Sometimes I go into another room and I say, "Why am I here?"
right. Yeah, I say that all the time. Why are we
The
here?
question was, why did
Why did
touring
they play so often?
negative?
Okay. So Brian Epstein and his philosophy with the Beatles was to have them play as often as possible while they're hot. You got to get them out playing. And he told Nat this, and Nat took that philosophy to the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Well, the Beatles played 30 or 40 minutes a night, and Mahavishnu played an hour and a half, 2 hours of just pounding music. It wasn't the same. It just took such a physical toll on these guys that after a while, I mean, it was all great for a while, but then, as Elliot Sears described it, one long continuous tour. Every once in a while they'd have a week, 2 weeks off, but normally a tour of a rock band would be, you go on tour for 6 weeks back in the day, 6 weeks, 8 weeks maybe, and then you have 4 or 5 months off. And then you come back, you're all refreshed, you've recorded maybe another album. But these guys didn't have time to even do a lot of new music because they were so busy that tunes that John was writing for later albums after In a Mounting Flame, they were worked on during sound checks of concerts. They just didn't have enough time. And you also have to remember, and this book isn't about this, this is just me talking, that these guys didn't know each other that well to begin with, a little bit. And they came together and they're playing this type of music. And they became friends, and there may be some not friends, but they didn't start as friends for the most part. And, that controlled a lot of what happened. And of course, it's an old story, but it's a new story at that time for jazz music, in the sense that all of a sudden these guys who were used to playing, jazz halls and clubs, they're playing big places, and there's a lot of money being thrown around, and the fame is difficult to deal with. And this is what happened, in the end. But I mentioned in the book that even when things were bad, and maybe people weren't getting along, they got along on stage, and sometimes listening to Mahavishnu in turmoil was just as interesting as when they were not.
Well, that's the thing about groups who become very successful. With Mahavishnu, you've got 5 virtuoso musicians. You've also got a group leader. Suddenly, as you mentioned, they're thrown into the situation. They don't know each other, but ego does come out. Conflicts are part of life. Was there any one thing, one incident, one issue that caused them to separate, or was it just a flow of different events over the course of the band's togetherness?
Well, there was a deterioration. However, the one event, there was an interview in Crawdaddy magazine where Jan Hammer and Jerry Goodman expressed their displeasure in what was happening, that they weren't quite getting enough credit, which was always an issue when it comes to jazz music. For instance, anybody that played with Miles Davis and the Miles Davis records and would have the same feeling. And by the way, even in some rock bands like Frank Zappa's. So John apparently really wasn't aware of that. And so when he read that article, it created a rift, So that's what happened. So I just saw one of the comments pop up about Frank Zappa playing complicated music, and I tried to make it clear I liked Frank Zappa. And of course he did. He did. I don't want to take anything away from him. but the percussionist from Zappa, Ruth Underwood, said that Frank's music changed after the Mahavishnu record, as did a couple other members. And I'm just listening to them, and I believe them.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we lost Frank much too soon.
Mhm.
He might have, who knows what directions he might have gone in later on. I was lucky to see the original Mothers. I saw a concert at the Boston Globe Jazz Festival in 1970, I believe. Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention were on a double bill with Rassan and Roland Kirk.
Yeah.
Rassan sat in with Frank Zappa,
Oh, cool.
and it was fantastic, man. I
Yeah.
mean, because Zappa was an excellent guitar player. I mean, he had no problems improvising. But Rassan and Roland Kirk.
Yeah, I have plenty of Zappa. I have plenty of Zappa stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm a Zappa fan myself. So after the group broke up, did John McLaughlin continue the Mahavishnu Orchestra?
Yeah, there was a second version of Mahavishnu, and some people have asked, it was an expanded unit. Some people have asked why I didn't write about that band's live performance. It was simply, I think, a combination of a few things. You can only be new once. And so I thought this time period from 71 to 73 with the first Mahavishnu was important because it was new. And also, just to write about those 2 years, I think there's 540 pages in this book. And if I was to write about another 2 years, it's just too much. So this book is entirely focused on the first Mahavishnu. Now, of course, Narda Walden, who was the drummer for the second band, and Jean-Luc Ponty, who played violin in the second band, they saw Mahavishnu live, the original one, and their memories are in this book.
Yeah. Now, we note very sadly the passing of Zakir Hussain, the great tabla player, who with John McLaughlin formed Shakti not long after the Mahavishnu Orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
And what are some of the other things from your perspective that John McLaughlin did after Mahavishnu that were noteworthy?
Well, I've written some books about that too. My Follow Your Heart book is about that too. You can almost not name it's difficult to name a genre that he hasn't been in, or somebody's interpreted his music that way. But, acoustic music, classical music in a sense, jazz, rock, everything. Now I'm going to speak a little out of school here. There's some unreleased music that I can't talk too much about, but I'm involved in it, and we're waiting for it to be released, that will introduce another aspect of John's great talent and composing especially. But we'll keep our fingers crossed that will see the light of day soon. It's a little frustrating, but it is show business. And show business has delayed the release of this material. That's coming soon, and that will be another aspect of John. People that know John really well realize a couple of things. One, that he is the spiritual person you talk about, but that he's also very down to earth. That's, I think, the thing that would surprise most people. He's very down to earth. At the same time, he is a conundrum because he is a genius. And I would propose not just a musical genius. You could be sitting at dinner, and all of a sudden the conversation goes to a battle in the American Civil War. And it's more than just knowledge. It's, it's theories about the battle and everything else. You could talk about astronomy, and John McLaughlin will start just telling you how many suns there are in the universe. It goes across the board. all of these guys personally, Rick, the late Rick included, very personable people when you have a chance to talk to them. I think Billy's a little more business-like, but I've never had any issues with Billy. Whenever I've asked him do an interview or anything like that, he's always been helpful. And I said that about all of these guys. And, to have Mahavishnu in the background for their entire career, I think has been good. And in some ways hasn't been so good. From the standpoint of how do you live up to that? But you do your own different things. And even John, problematic for John in that sense, too. Like I said before, you can only be new once. But these guys have been involved in many different things over the years. And they still remember, I believe, the adulation that they got from these live concerts back in the day. And so that's what I'm focusing on in this book is the criticism, the adulation, what it felt like to be in a Mahavishnu audience, what it felt like to open up for them, to close for them. It was varied reactions in 540 pages.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, those of us who were lucky enough to see the Mahavishnu Orchestra live during those years still have very strong memories, but most people didn't. The good news is that there are videos on YouTube of the band performing of varying quality. Some are barely acceptable, some are actually quite good. Off the top of your head, Walter, can you recommend any of the videos on YouTube with the
Well,
Mahavishnu?
the must-have is the ABC in concert show. The video isn't of the highest quality, but it doesn't matter. And if you can get the stereo mix that appeared on your local radio station, some of the versions have that. It's even more powerful. But that's the first time I saw Mahavishnu late at night on ABC's In Concert. And that thing, to this day, I've probably watched it 500 times, if I was to take a guess. That is, to me, the best video. If you wanted to explain to somebody about the power of Mahavishnu or what it could do, that would be the tape to show. They play one word on there with the famous Billy Cobham solo. But there's from Don Kirshner's Rock Concert is another video that's out there. There's one from Chateaubriand in France that's long. That suffers from dead sound. I wish they had some reverb in it. And I don't think those people knew in that crowd what was going on. They were pretty quiet. They didn't know what to deal with. So it's from a standpoint of having an impact on you, the Chateaubriand video isn't as good, but it's there and you're happy about anything. Now, one of the things I discovered writing this book is, they were taped other times. And I'm in search for some of those tapes. And if somebody reads something and there's some clues in there that can help us, we'll find them. My friend Ted McCallion, through a friend, journalist friend, did come across a Mahavishnu tape from a show called Telerock, which was put out by a public television station out west. That's on the internet, and it's well worth watching, even with the old psychedelic effects. Every time you want to see John McLaughlin hit a string, you see these whirly effects instead, which is maddening, but that's the way it was back then. There was a show called Pop Deux in France, an hour-long sort of documentary show. That is lost. The rumor, again, I go into this in the book. Many of those shows have been found of various artists. And the Mahavishnu one, apparently the video exists, but they've lost the audio. One of the people in the book, Alain, he had a tape. He was at the show, but also had the tape of the show, the audio tape, and he can't find it. Oh boy, so frustrating. But that's, When you do research like this, you're on a big hunt, and hunt has a thrill to it. And you find out about something you never knew about. You want to get to the bottom of it. It may take you a few months. And you may not get to the very bottom of it, but it opens up a whole panoply, is that the right word? Panoply of opportunities to search elsewhere, which, believe me, I got into rabbit holes many I'd say late nights, 1 or 2 in the morning. I'd be here typing away. And in fact, that's when I did my best work, maybe 11 o'clock at night to 2 a.m., when everything was quiet and life didn't interfere so much.
Yeah, you were in the zone.
I was in the zone. Absolutely. Now, sometimes the zone, there was a period of time where life interfered. I didn't write anything for six months. And then I went back to it and wrote 20 pages in a night. I mean, it really depends on what's going. This. It really depends on what's happening and how the flow is going. So sometimes it was going really well. Now, you'll also know this. Sometimes I'd go back and I'd read 20 pages and I'd be unhappy with it, and I'd hit the delete button and delete all 20 pages and start over.
Yeah, for sure.
That happens.
Writer's life.
Oh, yeah. You can't fall in love with what you've written.
No.
You can't. So if it's not up to what you want it to be, you have to deep six it.
I've done some playwriting. I've actually written 7 plays that have been produced by a small theater company that I co-founded. And I had a master class once with Athol Fugard, who's a great South African playwright who's still with us. And when I was writing these plays, I was like rewriting. I mean, so I said to him, Athol, when you write a play, how many revisions do you do? He said, usually 5. And if people read my first draft, they'd think I was a madman. So writing is rewriting.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's rewriting. And because I was able to rewrite, I was able to go back into some of these concerts and learn, more about the concerts that I knew before, and find out more people that were at them that I didn't know before, and find out the experiences, and wish that I was at, every show. I wish I were at any bad show just to see what that experience might be. Yeah. And to Mahavishnu, to those guys, they had bad shows. We may not realize it. Of course, they played sometimes, say at a rock festival where nobody paid attention to them. And you say, how could you do that? It's like playing a Playboy Jazz Festival at supper time. If you're the act at supper time at the Hollywood Bowl, nobody's going to listen to you. That's the way it is. But here, we have one of the great aspects to me about the book is going back and reading about and writing and researching all about all the college shows, all the shows at colleges. It was so different, and they were marketed different. And of course, back then, it was about selling the records. And so the concert would cost you $2 if it cost you anything, to go in there. And the record companies had divisions that just handled the colleges. They don't have that anymore. And Mahavishnu was really popular, of course, on the East Coast, going up and down, some of the Ivy League schools up and down the East Coast, and New York, of course, and Massachusetts, and places like that. Much less so down south. With the exception of a few metropolitan cities, they did not appear. I mean, it's no accident. There's no Mahavishnu live from Mobile, Alabama, or Mississippi. It just didn't happen. We had our own version of blue and red states back then. Not getting political, but there were certain states Mahavishnu or any group like that was going to be in. and other states they weren't going to be in. And a few times, the band was grouped with Marshall Tucker, well-known country rock band. And it depended on where the show was. If the show was south of the Mason-Dixon line, the crowd was there to see Marshall Tucker. If it was north, they were to see Mahavishnu. I mean, it was really that distinct of a line.
Yeah.
It really was. But Mahavishnu would be on the same bill as the Allman Brothers, some festivals and whatnot. It's funny because when you listen, especially to some of the Allman Brothers or band members at the time, you'd think they played, 20 times. They didn't. But it leads me to believe that the appearances were so memorable that they stuck in the mind. And you had mentioned earlier Aerosmith, and Aerosmith's first national tour was with Mahavishnu, and they were not well received for the most part, which is unfortunate because you have to take a step back, and by any measure, Aerosmith was a really good rock and roll band. And a few of the reviewers noticed this, and they mentioned this. But I remember the comments from those guys, and they were, I don't want to say embarrassed, but intimidated might be a better word, by Mahavishnu, by having to open up for them. But in the end, Steve, the guitar player, mentioned that it was good for them in the end. Same with Blue Oyster Cult. Blue Oyster Cult was on the same bill with Mahavishnu, and they were scared shitless, to use the vernacular. But they said that after the tour, they made it a point to up their game. And they did. They started playing stuff later that was a little more advanced and whatnot, but putting on a better show. And these are the type of things that happen because of this interaction.
Yeah. Well, as I said before, it wasn't unusual for groups and listeners to get into different genres of music. The music business pigeonholed. What kind of music is it exactly? How would you describe it? And many groups you can't describe, in just a picture.
Well, they don't want to be described. If you're talking to John or anybody else and you start talking fusion, they don't know what that is. I mean, they know what the definition is. Now, I would argue that we need these words because and nobody wants to be categorized. But for a beginning of discussion, you need to be in some type of category. You need to be in a category in the old days in the record store. Where are we going to find this? And so you get categorized. But of course, they're correct. Music is music, art is art, writing is writing. But I want to know where the fiction is in the bookstore. Something, by the way, I don't read. I only read nonfiction. Now, I've read some great novels, don't get me wrong, but I'm more interested in history and nonfiction. And then if you read enough history, you can determine who's telling the truth and who isn't, because, from a certain aspect of it. And that's the way I look at this book, too. I also did this book for the purpose of history. I don't know what form concerts are going to take 5 years from now. It's always changing. And I just think that this information needed to be in one place about a phenomenon that occurred in the early 1970s when other musical phenomenons were occurring. And I happen to think the most fertile period in the last, 75 years was the late 60s, early 70s. That's my own opinion. Not just because I was there. I was actually a little young. Most of my stuff is looking back in hindsight. And of course, some of the beginnings of this music were before Miles Davis, if we really want to get into it. But And lots of times the music that people hear these days, those elements are in it. They just don't know it. They're just not aware of it, which is
Yeah.
okay. But that's another reason for posterity to write a book like this. That once upon a time it was like this.
Yeah.
And if I can transport you back to your own memory, or if I can give you new memories or give you an idea if you're younger what it was like, then I feel good about that.
Well, you should feel very good about it, Walter. It's an excellent book, an excellent read, and I think really important documentation. And I'm really glad you did it. We burned through an hour here rather quickly. I appreciate you taking the time, and I appreciate our viewers, our listeners here, who've kept up a steady stream of comments.
Yeah, I see there were comments mostly, not questions, but
Yeah.
I appreciate all the participation. I really do, and we'll replay this video as often as we can.
Yeah,
For others that haven't seen it.
This will be up on YouTube and Facebook. And please pick up the book, Mahavishnu Memories. There's a link underneath there it is. There's the cover. Link to the Amazon where you can get it. Keep listening to Mahavishnu's music. Those records are still incredible. And jump over to YouTube so you can see what the band looked like. I'm Brett Premack, and I want to thank you for a wonderful interview, Walter. And I want to wish everyone in our viewing audience a healthy and happy 2025. Bye-bye.
My wishes too. Thank you, Brett.